It was 1 a.m. on a frigid Christmas Eve when Jenny Sodder woke to the blood-chilling smell of smoke. The downstairs was engulfed in flames, and 5 of her young children were trapped in the upstairs bedrooms. Frantic, her husband George raced into the freezing night to grab his rescue ladder, only to find it had mysteriously vanished. He desperately tried to start his 2 coal trucks to climb to the window, but both engines were completely dead. The house burned to the ground, but when the ashes cooled, there were no bodies. The nightmare was only just beginning. It was Christmas Eve 1945 in Fayetteville, West Virginia. Outside it was a frigid night, the kind of biting winter cold that freezes the earth solid and makes the trees creak in the wind. But inside the Sodder home, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was warm, vibrant, and filled with life. The younger children were ecstatic, staying up late in the living room to play with the new toys they had just received from the local dime store. The older boys, Maurice and Louis, had briefly stepped out into the freezing dark to feed the animals one last time before bed. It was a picture-perfect, joyful holiday scene, standing in stark contrast to the pitch-black, sinister woods surrounding their property. By midnight, the house had finally fallen quiet as the family drifted off to sleep, but the peace wouldn't last. At exactly 12:30 a.m., the shrill ring of the telephone shattered the silence. Jenny Sodder woke with a start. Clutching her nightgown against the chill, she walked downstairs to answer it. The voice on the other end asked for a name she didn't recognize, but it wasn't just a simple wrong number. In the background, Jenny heard the clinking of glasses and a distinct, chilling sound laughter. It wasn't festive. It was a cruel, mocking laughter that made the hair on her arms stand up. Unsettled, she hung up the receiver. That's when she looked around and realized something was terribly wrong with the house. The downstairs lights were still burning brightly. The curtains were drawn wide open, leaving the inside of the home completely exposed to whoever or whatever was out there in the dark. And when she checked the front door, it was completely unlocked. Assuming the kids had just been careless in their holiday excitement, Jenny locked the door, closed the curtains, and went back to bed. As she tried to fall back asleep, a heavy, loud thump suddenly struck the roof, followed by the sound of something rolling down the shingles. She tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the wind. But 30 minutes later, she woke up again, this time to the blood-chilling smell of smoke. Chaos ensued. George and Jenny rushed out of their bedroom. The downstairs was already engulfed, and thick, toxic smoke billowed toward the ceiling. The staircase leading up to the second floor, where 5 of their children were sleeping, was an impassable wall of searing heat and flames. Driven by unimaginable panic, George sprinted barefoot out into the freezing night to save his kids from the outside. He ran to the side of the house to grab his heavy rescue ladder. It wasn't there. It had mysteriously vanished from its usual spot. Frantic, he raced to his 2 coal trucks, planning to park them against the house so he could climb up to the windows. He cranked the ignition of the first truck. Nothing. He tried the second. Completely dead. Both engines, which had worked perfectly just hours before, refused to start. In a final, desperate act, he ran to the rain barrel to throw water on the flames, but the winter was so unforgiving that the water inside was frozen solid. I gotta be honest with you, imagining a father standing barefoot in the ice, screaming his children's names into a roaring inferno, while every single tool to save them has been systematically stripped away. It's absolutely devastating. He was trapped in his own nightmare, watching his home burn. But what no one knew was, this absolute helplessness wasn't a coincidence. As George stood in the freezing winter air, helplessly watching his family's home turn into an inferno, his eldest daughter Marion was desperately sprinting barefoot down the pitch-black highway to get help. She reached a neighbor's house to call the fire department, but the telephone operator simply didn't respond. The situation was so dire that another neighbor actually drove into town to physically track down Fire Chief F.J. Morris. The Fayetteville Fire Department operated on a volunteer phone tree system, which admittedly took time, but the fire station was located a mere 2.5 miles away from the Sodder home. Yet inexplicably, the firefighters did not arrive on the scene until 8 a.m. the next morning. 7 agonizing hours after the fire began. I gotta be honest with you, 7 hours for a 2.5-mile drive. Does this make your blood boil too? Let me know below. By the time the authorities finally pulled up, the house was nothing but a smoldering pile of ash and ruin. The time for a desperate rescue was long gone. Now, it was supposed to be a recovery mission. The firefighters began sifting through the still smoking wreckage, looking for the physical remains of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. But what they found, or rather, what they didn't find, defied all logic. There were no bodies. There were no skulls. There wasn't even a single, solitary fragment of bone. Fire Chief Morris casually declared that the blaze must have been so incredibly hot that it completely cremated all 5 children, without any thorough forensic investigation. The coroner's office rapidly issued death certificates less than a week later. The official cause of the devastating fire: faulty wiring. But George and Jenny knew that was a blatant impossibility. Jenny vividly remembered that when she woke up to the blood-chilling smell of smoke and walked out of her bedroom, the downstairs lights were still burning brightly. If an electrical short had started the blaze, the power would have completely failed. The lights shouldn't have been on. The hasty ruling was an insult to their devastating grief. And the sheer lack of bones. It began to gnaw at Jenny's sanity. She read about other tragic house fires where victims perished, and in every single recorded case, skeletons were recovered. Refusing to accept the authorities' dismissive story, Jenny conducted her own grim experiments. She took thick animal bones from their kitchen and baked them in her oven at the absolute highest temperature, desperately trying to see if she could reduce them to ash. She couldn't. They remained fully intact. Seeking the undeniable truth, Jenny consulted an employee at a local crematorium. His confirmation was chilling. Even when human bodies are incinerated at a staggering 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for over 2 hours, the bones are always left behind. The Sodder house had only burned for about 45 minutes before the structure collapsed. Even the metal household appliances were found in the rubble, retaining their shapes. 5 human beings don't just vaporize into thin air. This is where the story takes a dark turn, because the authorities weren't just incompetent. They were hiding something. The realization that 5 children couldn't simply vanish into ash was agonizing enough. But when spring arrived, the devastating truth about that frigid Christmas Eve began to unearth itself, proving that the family's helplessness was meticulously orchestrated. George was overseeing the construction of a new home near the memorial site when a telephone repairman approached him with a chilling discovery. The repairman had climbed the pole to inspect the wiring leading to the old Sodder house. What he found wasn't wire melted by the intense heat of a fire. It had been intentionally and cleanly severed. Someone had deliberately climbed up there in the pitch-black night and cut their only lifeline to the outside world. To reach that height, the saboteur would have needed a ladder. Suddenly, a horrific realization hit George. He sprinted toward the back of his property, frantically searching the brush until he found his heavy rescue ladder, the very tool he needed to save his kids, thrown into a ditch 75 feet away from the house. The police soon tracked down a local thief named Lunny Johnson, who had been caught stealing a block and tackle from the property the morning after the blaze. When interrogated, Johnson made a twisted, blood-chilling confession. He admitted he was at the Sodder home the night of the fire. He confessed to stealing the ladder, using it to slice the phone lines so the family couldn't call the cops, and then hiding the ladder in the ditch before fleeing. Yet, despite this man admitting to sabotaging the home just moments before it became a roaring inferno, the police inexplicably cleared him of any involvement in the fire itself. This is where the story takes a dark turn, because the most sinister betrayal didn't come from local criminals. It came directly from the people sworn to protect them. In 1947, the family's private investigator uncovered a rumor circulating around Fayetteville that was so sickening it defies belief. Whispers claimed that Fire Chief F.J. Morris, the same man who arrived 7 hours late and hastily blamed faulty wiring, had actually found a human organ in the ashes on Christmas morning. He supposedly hid this organ inside a wooden dynamite box and buried it in secret at the site. Desperate and horrified, George and Jenny forced Chief Morris to reveal the location. With their own hands, the grieving parents dug into the dirt, their hearts pounding with unimaginable dread. They found the dynamite box. They pried it open, bracing themselves for the horrifying reality of their children's remains. Inside was a shriveled, fleshy mass. But when a local funeral director examined the contents, he delivered a jaw-dropping revelation. It wasn't a human organ at all. It was a chunk of fresh, unburned beef liver. When confronted with this absolute insanity, Chief Morris confessed. He admitted he had specifically acquired the raw meat, buried it himself, and deliberately planted the rumors in town. His twisted excuse: he claimed he wanted the family to find it so they would finally accept that the children died and have peace. This wasn't just a tragic oversight. It was a calculated, psychological torment. If the fire chief was willing to bury animal meat to fake the deaths of 5 children, what else were they covering up? The twisted beef liver stunt by the fire chief proved one terrifying thing to George and Jenny Sodder. The authorities were actively trying to force them to stop asking questions. But why? To understand the chilling motive behind the blaze, we have to rewind the timeline to the months leading up to that tragic Christmas Eve. When you look at the precursors, you realize this wasn't a random accident. It was a meticulously planned, sinister nightmare. It all started in the fall of 1945. George, a hardworking Italian immigrant, was a fiercely outspoken critic of the dictator Benito Mussolini. His vocal political views had sparked some bitter, heated arguments within Fayetteville's small Italian-American community. One afternoon, a life insurance salesman came to the Sodder home. When George firmly declined to buy a policy, the man didn't just walk away disappointed. His anger boiled over into a hyper-specific, terrifying threat. He looked George dead in the eye and yelled, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." At the time, George brushed it off as the unhinged rant of a disgruntled salesman. But looking back in the ashes of his home, it was a horrifying prophecy. The unsettling events only escalated. Just days before the fire, Jenny was working in the kitchen when she looked out the window to watch her younger children walking home from school along Highway 21. She noticed an unfamiliar car parked on the street. Inside was a strange man, and he wasn't just glancing around, he was intensely, aggressively watching her kids and studying the layout of the house. I gotta be honest, thinking about a grown man stalking young children on their way home from school, just days before a deadly attack, makes me absolutely sick to my stomach. Then came the definitive, undeniable physical proof of the attack itself. Months after the blaze, a witness who had been driving a bus that frigid night finally came forward. He told police a blood-chilling detail as he drove past the property. He saw someone actively throwing balls of fire onto the roof of the Sodder home. This revelation prompted the family to search the yard once again. As they scoured the grass, little toddler Sylvia wandered over and picked up a strange, hard rubber object hidden in the brush. It looked like a dark, heavy ball with a cap on it. When George's oldest son, John, who had served in the military, examined it, his blood ran cold. It wasn't a piece of debris. It was an unexploded incendiary grenade, a military-grade napalm pineapple bomb specifically designed to start massive, uncontrollable fires. Suddenly, the timeline of that horrific night clicked into place. The loud thump on the roof, the sound of something rolling down the shingles that woke Jenny up just before the smoke billowed in. The fire hadn't started in the downstairs fuse box. It had been intentionally ignited from the roof down. No one could have predicted what happened next, as the realization set in that the fire was just a diversion, and the children might not have burned at all. With the unexploded incendiary grenade discovered in the yard, a horrifying new theory took hold in George and Jenny's minds. The fire wasn't meant to kill the children at all. It was a chaotic diversion, a blazing smokescreen designed to cover up a targeted kidnapping. Suddenly, the frantic chase was on. The grieving parents began scouring the state, desperate to find their kids before they vanished for good, and the leads that poured in were absolutely chilling. About a week after the inferno, A woman working at a hotel in nearby Charleston, West Virginia, contacted the police with a disturbing report. She claimed 4 of the 5 missing Sodder children had checked in around midnight. They weren't alone. They were accompanied by 2 women and 2 men of Italian extraction. The witness stated that when she tried to speak to the children in a friendly manner, the men became immediately aggressive and hostile. They physically blocked her, freezing her out and refusing to let her interact with the kids. The group fled early the next morning. This sighting perfectly matched George's darkest fears about retaliation for his anti-Mussolini views. Armed with this information, the Sodders went to the local authorities, begging for a manhunt. Instead, the justice system slammed the door in their faces. This part really makes my blood boil when you realize how deep the betrayal ran. Remember that unhinged life insurance salesman? The one who stood in George's yard and explicitly threatened that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. In a twist so sinister it feels unreal, the family's private investigator discovered that this exact same salesman was a seated member of the coroner's jury. Yes, the very jury that swiftly and conveniently ruled the deadly fire a simple accident, due to faulty wiring. How does a man who threatened to burn down a family's house end up on the official jury investigating that exact fire? George and Jenny took this blatant, devastating conflict of interest straight to the local prosecuting attorney, demanding an immediate investigation. The prosecutor looked at the evidence and flatly refused to do his job, his shocking excuse. He stated he didn't want to bring a case against the people with whom he lived and ate. Completely abandoned by their own town, the Sodders took their plea to the highest level in 1947, the FBI. Surprisingly, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover responded. He officially offered to send federal agents to Fayetteville to assist in a kidnapping investigation. But there was a catch: the FBI needed permission from the local authorities to intervene. In a move that defies all logic and morality, the Fayetteville police and fire departments flat out denied the FBI's offer. They blocked federal agents from looking for 5 missing children. The local police literally said no to the FBI. Drop your take in the comments. Am I missing something, or is this a massive cover-up? And then the chase was on, but this time, it was an agonizing pursuit that would span decades, ultimately leading to a single, haunting photograph. With the local police slamming the door on the FBI and the justice system actively protecting its own, George and Jenny Sodder were entirely on their own. The frantic chase slowly morphed into a decades-long, agonizing stalemate. In 1952, refusing to let their children be forgotten, the family erected a massive billboard along Route 16, right at the site of the ashes. It featured the unsmiling faces of all 5 missing children and a haunting, desperate question: what was their fate? Kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive? That billboard stood there for nearly 40 years. I couldn't stop thinking about how absolutely devastating that must have been, driving past a giant, public monument to your own unanswered trauma every single day of your life. The family chased every single tip, no matter how thin. George drove all the way to New York just to see a girl in a newspaper photo. Jenny demanded police records to clear her own relatives in Florida. They lived in a constant state of paranoia, unable to mourn, unable to move on. Then, in 1968, 23 grueling years after that frigid Christmas Eve, a letter arrived. It was addressed specifically to Jenny. There was no return address, just a postmark from Central City, Kentucky. Inside the envelope was a photograph of a young man in his mid-20s. When George and Jenny looked at the picture, their breath caught in their throats. The man had the exact same dark brown eyes, dark curly hair, straight nose, and upwardly tilting left eyebrow as their son, Louis, who was only 9 when the fire broke out. But it was the handwritten note on the back of the photo that sent a chill down their spines. It read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Ilo boys a 90132 or 35. It was the most tangible, solid piece of evidence they had ever received. Reinvigorated by this blood-chilling spark of hope, the family scraped together their money and hired yet another private detective to travel to Kentucky to find the young man in the photograph. The detective packed his bags, headed to Kentucky, and then he vanished. He was never heard from again. He never called, never wrote, and never returned to West Virginia. Some on the internet theorize he just took the money and ran, but others wonder if he stumbled into a conspiracy so dark and dangerous that he had to be permanently silenced. The trail ran completely, irrevocably cold. This final, twisted dead end broke George Sodder. A year later, in 1969, at the age of 74, he passed away. His heart gave out after a lifetime of relentless, torturous searching, dying in absolute despair without ever knowing what happened to his babies. The family spent their entire lives looking across the country, chasing ghosts, corrupt officials, and shadowy mafia figures. The horrifying truth is, sometimes the answers we are looking for are buried right under our feet. For decades, the Sodder family chased ghosts across the country, hunting for mafia kidnappers, silencing detectives, and corrupt officials. But the most devastating truth about that frigid Christmas Eve wasn't hiding in a hotel in Charleston, or a mysterious photograph from Kentucky. It was buried in the dirt of their own front yard. When we peel back the layers of local corruption and look strictly at the cold, hard forensic reality, the impossible vanishing of 5 children finally makes sense. People always fixate on the fact that the house only burned for 45 minutes, arguing that it wasn't nearly long enough to vaporize human bones, but they completely forget what was sitting right beneath the floorboards. Like most Appalachian homes in the winter of 1945, the Sodders had a basement packed full of coal for heating. When the burning structure collapsed in on itself, the blazing timber crashed directly into that massive coal reserve. The basement essentially transformed into a gigantic, subterranean furnace. It didn't just burn for 45 minutes, it ignited the coal and smoldered continuously at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees for days. In that kind of sustained, catastrophic, oven-like heat, the fragile, developing bones of young children wouldn't just burn, they would completely calcify, fracture, and become totally indistinguishable from the thick layers of rubble and ash. But here is the detail that absolutely breaks my heart, the ultimate tragic irony of this entire nightmare. Why didn't investigators eventually find those microscopic, calcified fragments? Because of George Sodder himself. Just days after the inferno, utterly shattered by grief and acting before any specialized forensic team could thoroughly excavate the site, George drove a bulldozer over the ruins. He dumped 5 feet of soil over the basement to create a memorial garden for his kids. In his desperate, loving need to honor them, he unknowingly and irreversibly destroyed the crime scene. He crushed whatever microscopic evidence remained of his own children, and those random bone fragments the Smithsonian found years later. They almost certainly came from the filled dirt George hauled in to cover the site. Yes, the local authorities were appallingly incompetent, and they lied to cover up their own negligence. Yes, the fire was very likely arson, a cruel, targeted attack meant to terrorize George. But the children were never kidnapped. They never made it out of that house. The real tragedy of the Sodder children isn't a sinister abduction. It's the horrifying reality of parents who simply could not process the unimaginable trauma of losing 5 babies at once. The terror of the unknown drove them to madness, forcing them to spend their entire lives searching for kids who had actually never left home. Finally, understanding the science strips away the terrifying thought of those children suffering in captivity for decades. They passed away together on that winter night, and now, the parents who loved them so fiercely are finally resting in peace beside them. What do you guys think? Does hearing the forensic reality bring you any sense of relief, or does it make the tragedy even worse? I'll keep digging if there's more to uncover. Thanks for watching and for all the comments, you guys make this worth it.